I heard it before I saw anything. The kind of laugh people use when they're showing off. It carried from the kitchen into the hallway, sharp and bright against the tile. I had just come in from the garage, still in my work jacket, thinking about leftovers and a quick shower. My name's Evan Price. I'm 38, an operations manager for a logistics company in Denver. I was reaching for a beer when I realized my wife had her friends on speaker. The laugh came again, then the sentence that reset the room around me. I control him with one thing. Works every time. I didn't stomp in or demand an explanation. I just stood there, hand on the fridge handle, listening to the compressor hum and my own breathing. I eased the door shut before it made a sound and stepped back into the shadows. The voices were familiar, the same two friends she always met for brunch, the same ones who joked about keeping the spark alive, which apparently meant treating our marriage like a marketing campaign. I can't recall her words perfectly, but the meaning was clear. If I pushed back, she froze me out. If I disagreed, she withheld. If I wanted closeness, it became a bargaining chip. My brain began flipping through old moments like an unspooling film reel. Nights she brushed past me without a word because I couldn't make a last-minute dinner. Weekends she went silent after I suggested we stick to a budget. Mornings when tomorrow never came. It wasn't betrayal, not in the conventional sense. It was worse in a way. It was strategy. Upstairs, I sat on the edge of our bed in the dim streetlight glow, staring at a dust line on the dresser. My job is to anticipate pressure points and remove them before the system fails. I'd been treating our marriage like a system that would self-correct if I just kept working, patient, steady, forgiving. That night, I realized I'd been wrong. I changed into a t-shirt and sat in the dark at my desk. I didn't need to overthink. The facts were simple. She'd traded partnership for manipulation and dressed it up as normal relationship ups and downs. The calm that came with clarity was almost surgical. I remembered how she scheduled our life and called it spontaneity, how her affection in front of friends vanished the moment the door closed, how her interest in owning my power began only after a certain book club. People try new ideas to see what fits, but this wasn't trying. It was reducing our marriage to a vending machine with one button she liked to press. A text from a buddy popped up, "Saturday hike?" I typed yes before I could stop myself. I realized how often I'd canceled things to keep my weekend open, just in case she decided we were good again. When had I started living on standby? That night, I made a list in my phone. Gym 3 mornings a week, Saturday hike, call my brother, book a checkup, get new boots. Small things, mine alone. No announcements, no negotiations. 2 days later, she floated into the kitchen with that light, practiced mood she uses when she's primed for a win. I was packing almonds and protein powder for the hike. Big plans? She asked. Yeah, early start, I said. I'll be out most of the day. A tiny pause, measured obedience check. We were going to look at rugs with Kara, but okay. Before, I would have shifted my day. This time, I sealed the container and said, "Hope you find a good one." Her smile wobbled just slightly. The week filled with moments like that. Little tests. Little silences. I passed them all by doing nothing unusual, except refusing to play. And that was the first quiet fracture. By the end of that week, the air in the house had changed. It wasn't tense exactly. More like the moment before a storm when you can smell rain but the ground is still dry. She kept circling, dropping little invitations to pull me back into our usual orbit. You should come with me to the gallery opening. We should get drinks Friday, just us. Remember how we used to binge that show? I said no to each, politely and without explanation. I'd started to realize that explanations were what she thrived on. Every reason I gave was another thread for her to tug, another opening to work her way back into the role of gatekeeper. No explanation meant no thread to pull. Saturday morning, I was up before dawn for another hike, this time with a bigger group. She padded into the kitchen in her robe, hair loose, holding her mug like she'd been waiting for me. You're really into these hikes, all of a sudden. Good way to clear my head, I said. She studied me for a beat. Then, clear your head about what? Everything. I slipped on my jacket and left before she could test the follow-up. That afternoon, I stopped at a coffee shop on the way home. While I waited for my drink, I noticed a couple at the corner table. They were laughing, leaning in, elbows almost touching. And the look, God, that look. That was the look I'd been chasing in our marriage without realizing it. The kind that says, I'm here because I want to be, not because you passed some invisible test. When I got home, she was on the phone in the living room, voice pitched low but urgent. I didn't catch much, just, he's acting different, and I'll keep you posted. My keys made a noise as I set them down, and she instantly went bright and casual. Hey, how was the hike? It was like watching an actor switch characters mid-scene. I felt the weight of it in my chest, but instead of confronting her, I just smiled. Good. Beautiful weather up there. Then I went upstairs, showered, and let her sit in whatever story she was spinning. By Monday, the calls had gotten longer. She closed the door to the den when she took them, something she'd never done before. She started leaving her phone face down on the counter, the same way I'd seen the night I first heard Evan on her lock screen reflection. I didn't ask questions. I didn't need to, not yet. The truth has a way of stepping into the light if you give it enough silence. Instead, I started preparing. I moved important files from the desk drawer to a locked cabinet at work. I changed the passwords on my personal accounts. And I reached out to an attorney I knew through a supplier, just for hypothetical advice. He didn't need much detail. If you're thinking about separation, start documenting everything now, he said. Dates, times, anything unusual. And don't tip your hand too early. It's not about catching someone in a lie. It's about making sure you're protected when the truth comes out. That night, as I was putting away dishes, she came in with that soft, too careful voice. Hey, you've seemed a little distant lately. I kept my back to her. Just been busy. With what? I turned then, leaning on the counter. With making sure I'm okay. The words seemed to land heavier than I intended. Her eyes narrowed just slightly, but she pasted on a smile. Of course. Well, let me know if you need anything. I watched her walk away and realized we were no longer living in the same marriage. We were living in two separate games. The difference was, she thought she still held the board. She had no idea I'd already started building my own. By midweek, the silence between us had taken on a different shape. It wasn't the cold, sulking kind we'd fallen into before. This was deliberate, surgical. I didn't press for conversation. I didn't fill the quiet with small talk. And she, in turn, started moving her pieces faster. I noticed it in the little things. She began dressing up more, even for quick errands. She changed her phone's notification tone, something I hadn't heard her do in years. And she suddenly became precious about her laptop, keeping it closed and tucked away in her tote bag, instead of leaving it open on the kitchen counter like she used to. Thursday evening, I came home earlier than usual. Her car was already in the driveway. I stepped inside and heard her voice upstairs, sharp and hushed. I couldn't make out every word, but the cadence was clear. This was no casual call. I caught next week and finalized before she lowered her tone again. I went about my business, fed the dog, poured a glass of water. By the time she came down, her face was bright with that overly neutral expression she used when she didn't want me to suspect anything. You're home early, she said, hanging her bag by the door. Yeah, slow day at work. I let the pause linger. Everything good? Of course. Why wouldn't it be? I shrugged. Just asking. She moved past me, busying herself with a pile of mail, but I could see the way her shoulders tensed. Something was in motion, and she was counting on me not to notice until it was too late. Later that night, while she showered, I went into the garage under the pretense of checking a shelf I'd been meaning to fix. I kept a small safe out there. Nothing fancy, just enough to hold passports, backup drives, and a few documents I didn't want lying around. I double-checked everything. All there. Then I added something new, a printed log of the past week's bank notifications, including a couple of odd, small withdrawals I hadn't authorized. I didn't need to prove anything yet. I just needed the record. On Friday, I left work early again, but this time I didn't go home right away. Instead, I parked a block over from the address of a cafe I'd seen on one of those receipts in the recycling bin weeks ago. I told myself I might be overreacting. I told myself I'd just sit there for 10 minutes and go. At 4:37, she appeared, walking fast, hair freshly curled. She went inside without glancing around. I couldn't see much through the window, but a few minutes later, a man joined her table. Dark jacket, leaned in close. They talked for 20 solid minutes. She laughed, really laughed, the way she used to with me in our first year. I didn't take photos. I didn't storm in. I just sat there, watching that laugh, and realized it wasn't mine anymore. Maybe it hadn't been for a long time. When I got home that night, I was calm. Too calm, maybe. She breezed in later than usual, claiming Kara had invited her to a last-minute dinner. I nodded, didn't challenge it. If she wanted me distracted, she'd have to work harder. That weekend, I laid out my plan in my head. Not a revenge fantasy, not a dramatic confrontation, just a clean extraction. My lawyer friend's words kept replaying, "Don't tip your hand too early." If she was making arrangements to leave, I could make mine too. But mine would be on my terms, not hers. On Sunday, I cleared my schedule for the week ahead. I knew something was coming. I could feel it like static before a lightning strike. She thought I was still in the dark, and I decided I was going to let her think that, until the exact moment I wasn't. Monday morning, she was up before me. That almost never happened. By the time I came downstairs, she was already dressed, makeup perfect, coffee in a travel mug, phone clutched in her hand. "Early meeting," she said, not looking at me as she slipped her shoes on. "Might be a long day." I just nodded. "Drive safe." She seemed almost disappointed I didn't ask more questions. I'd noticed that, how she thrived when I gave her a reaction, good or bad. Lately, I'd been giving her none, and it was starting to make her restless. Around lunchtime, I called my lawyer contact. We spoke in careful, clipped phrases, the way people do when they don't want to be overheard even in their own offices. He laid it out plainly. What papers I'd need ready, how long the process would take, how to position things so there wouldn't be any last-minute surprises. "If she's already planning something," he said, "you'll want to make sure you're the one steering. People make impulsive choices when they think they've cornered someone." That line stuck with me. That evening, she came home later than usual again, smiling in that controlled way, like she'd been rehearsing her face in the car. "Sorry, work dinner," she said, breezing past me toward the kitchen. She didn't notice my eyes follow her as she set her phone on the counter, screen down, and stepped into the pantry. It buzzed. Once, twice, 3 times. I didn't touch it, but I could read the preview from where I stood. "Evan, can't wait for next week." Her voice came from the pantry, too light, too quick. "Do we have any of that rosemary bread left?" When she returned, the phone was in her hand again. She saw me looking, and for the briefest second, her expression froze. Then she smiled. "What?" I shrugged. "Nothing," and I walked out of the room. The next 2 days were more of the same. Quick exits in the morning, closed-door phone calls at night, the occasional careful question about my own schedule. I gave her the answers she wanted to hear, the ones that made me sound predictable, available, easy to map around. But on Wednesday afternoon, I took a personal half-day without telling her. I drove by the same cafe from before, but she wasn't there. Instead, I ended up at the park near the river, sitting in my truck with the windows cracked, thinking about how strange it felt to prepare for the end of something while still eating dinner together every night. That evening, she seemed especially cheerful. She made pasta, poured me a glass of wine, asked about my day with more interest than she'd shown in weeks. I could feel her testing the ground beneath her feet, making sure it was still solid. When we finished eating, she sat back and said, "So, next week I might need a few nights to myself, just to catch up on some projects." I kept my tone neutral. "Sure, whatever you need." She tilted her head, studying me. "You're being very agreeable lately." I met her eyes. "Just trying to make sure you've got what you want." She smiled again, but there was a flicker there, something that told me she wasn't sure anymore what I knew. By Thursday morning, I'd made my decision. I was done waiting for her to pull the trigger on whatever she thought she had planned. If she wanted to end this, I was going to make sure I controlled the moment it began. I spent that day finalizing documents, arranging a meeting with my lawyer for Friday afternoon, and moving a few personal items out of the house under the guise of donating old stuff. Every step made me feel lighter, like I was quietly reclaiming pieces of myself she didn't even realize she'd been holding. That night, as she sat on the couch scrolling her phone, I looked at her and thought, 2 more days. That's all I need. She had no idea the countdown had already started. Friday morning felt different before I even opened my eyes. I could hear her moving around upstairs, heels clicking on the hardwood, drawers opening and closing. It was too much noise for a normal workday. She was in a rush, but not the frazzled kind of rush you get when you oversleep. This was the careful, deliberate rush of someone with a plan. When I came into the kitchen, she was dressed in a way that wasn't for the office, more like for a date. Light blue dress, hem brushing just above the knee, hair curled into loose waves, perfume strong enough to catch me from across the room. She glanced at me like she'd half hoped I wouldn't notice. "Big plans today?" I asked casually, pouring coffee into my travel mug. "Just a long meeting," she said, eyes darting toward her phone on the counter. "Don't wait up if it runs late." I nodded, letting the pause hang between us. "All right, drive safe." The door closed behind her, and I stood there for a full minute, listening to the house breathe. You learn to read silences in a marriage. This one was saying she had someplace to be that wasn't on any calendar we shared. At 1 o'clock, I was downtown, sitting across from my lawyer in a small office lined with thick law books and framed certificates. The folder I brought was heavier than it looked. Bank statements, printed call logs, a timeline I'd been quietly building, and copies of receipts from places I hadn't been. He flipped through each page slowly, careful not to rush. "You're ready," he said at last, leaning back in his chair. "If you want this filed first thing Monday, I can make that happen." "Monday," I said, the words settling in my chest like an anchor. Saying it out loud made it real in a way I hadn't felt until that moment. We went through the steps: property division, accounts, how to handle the initial conversation, and the safest way to manage anything unpredictable. He repeated the same advice he'd given before. Don't telegraph your move until you're ready to commit. You've already got control here. Don't give it back. Driving home, the streets looked the same as they always did. Kids riding bikes along the sidewalk, a neighbor mowing his lawn, but I felt like I was seeing it all from a distance, as if my part in this familiar life was already ending. When she came home later that night, she was glowing with energy. "Long day," she said, dropping her purse on the counter. She went straight into a story about a team project at work, hands moving animatedly, hitting all the right beats to make it sound authentic. I nodded at the right places, but my mind was elsewhere. I was counting hours, not listening to sentences. Saturday morning, she left early again, supposedly for yoga, but she was wearing the same dress from Friday. Subtle changes, but I noticed. I didn't follow her. I didn't need to. By now, it was obvious who she was meeting. The rest of the day, I carried on as if nothing was different. Groceries, laundry, a stop at the hardware store for a replacement hinge. I didn't want her to suspect anything, not with Monday so close. If she thought I was still coasting along, it would make the timing sharper. That evening, she came home humming, texting so quickly she didn't notice me in the doorway. When she finally looked up, her face shifted instantly into her at-home smile, the kind she thought would smooth over whatever I might have noticed. "What?" she asked. "Nothing," I said, and walked past her. Sunday night was quiet. Too quiet. We sat on opposite ends of the couch with a show playing that neither of us was following. I caught her glancing at me a few times, like she wanted to test the water, but she never spoke. I didn't mind the silence. I knew exactly how it would end. Monday morning would be the day. That night was a quiet one, but not the kind of quiet we'd been living with for months. This was the heavy, unnatural quiet that sits in the air after a car crash. Everything intact on the surface, but you know the damage is already done underneath. She didn't bring up what I'd said right away. Instead, she busied herself in the kitchen, opening and closing cabinets, reheating leftovers neither of us touched. Every few minutes, she'd glance toward the stairs where I'd disappeared earlier, as if debating whether to follow me up. I stayed in the bedroom, laptop open but work untouched. My mind wasn't racing, it was methodical. I'd been rehearsing this stage in my head for weeks. How she'd try to gauge my exact knowledge, how she'd dangle partial truths to see if I'd bite. Around 9, there was a light knock. She stepped in, hands clasped, voice soft. "Can we talk?" I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair. "Go ahead." She hesitated. "I feel like maybe there's been a misunderstanding." I just looked at her. The silence made her fill the space. "I mean, Evan's just a friend. We've been working on a project together. It's not." "Stop," I said quietly. "You don't have to explain. I've already handled it." Her brow furrowed. "Handled what?" "The paperwork," I said, letting the words land without a flicker of emotion. "By next week, you'll be free to do whatever you want." I saw the color drain from her cheeks. "You're serious?" "Completely." She stepped further into the room, searching my face. "So you've been planning this? For how long?" I didn't answer that one. Her knowing the exact timeline didn't change anything. It only gave her places to poke. The rest of the night was a blur of half-hearted attempts from her to reclaim some ground. She floated the idea of slowing down, of taking a breath to figure things out. I kept my responses neutral. No need. It's already set in motion. The next morning, she was up early, moving around the house like she couldn't find a comfortable place to stand. She tried being overly kind, making coffee for me, setting it next to my chair without asking. Then she tried picking fights about small things, laundry left unfolded, mail stacked too high on the counter. None of it got the reaction she wanted. By midday, I got a text from her. "Can we talk after dinner?" I replied with a simple, "We can talk now." She came into my office at home a few minutes later, closing the door behind her. "I don't understand how you can just shut it down like this," she said, her voice tight. "It's not shutting it down," I replied. "It's accepting reality." She shook her head. "You don't even know the whole story." "I know enough." The way her eyes flickered told me that sentence landed exactly where I wanted it to. It said I'd seen more than she realized, maybe even more than I had. It left her wondering which pieces of her story I'd already uncovered. By the time evening came, the silence between us had solidified into something permanent. We moved around each other like strangers in an airport, polite but disconnected, aware that the flight was leaving soon and we wouldn't be on the same one. Before bed, I gathered a few more personal items, things she wouldn't notice were gone until much later, and put them in my truck. My side of the closet looked a little emptier, my desk drawer a little lighter. Lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, I realized I wasn't dreading the next few days. I was ready for them. She could stall, plead, or spin stories all she wanted. The end was no longer a possibility. It was a date on the calendar, and it was almost here. Tuesday morning came with a gray sky and the smell of rain. I woke early, not because I couldn't sleep, but because I wanted the head start. My lawyer had called the night before. Everything was ready. All that was left was handing her the envelope. Downstairs, I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, listening to the hum of the refrigerator. She came down in a sweater and jeans, casual but still put together, as if she'd dressed for comfort without wanting to look like she was trying too hard. Her eyes lingered on me longer than usual. "Morning," she said cautiously. "Morning." I slid the envelope across the table. She looked at it like it might burn her fingers. "What's this?" "Read it," I said. She opened it slowly, scanning the first few lines. Her lips pressed together, jaw tightening. "You actually went through with it." "I told you I would." Her hands shook slightly as she set the papers down. "So that's it. You're not even going to try to fix this?" I met her eyes. "You made your choice weeks ago. I'm just making mine now." She looked like she wanted to argue, but nothing came out. Instead, she stood, walked to the sink, and gripped the counter with both hands. The silence stretched, filled only by the faint patter of rain against the windows. "Finally," she said, "I didn't think you'd do it. I thought you'd just let it slide." "That was the mistake," I said, thinking I'd never notice, or that I'd notice and still stay. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then I stood, picked up my jacket from the chair, and walked to the door. She turned, her expression somewhere between disbelief and resignation. "So what now?" "Now," I said, "you tell him you'll be free by next week." Her mouth opened slightly, like she might deny it again, but I didn't wait for her to speak. I stepped out into the damp air, the rain cool on my face. My truck was already packed with the few things I cared to take right away. The rest could come later. As I pulled out of the driveway, I glanced once in the rearview mirror. She was standing in the doorway, arms wrapped around herself, watching me go. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't performing. No practiced smile, no careful tone. Just quiet, raw stillness. I turned the corner and didn't look back again. Driving away, I expected to feel the weight of what I was leaving behind. Instead, I felt light. The kind of light that comes when you finally stop carrying something that was never yours to hold alone. By next week, the paperwork would be filed, the formalities set in motion. She'd have the freedom she'd been angling for, and I'd have mine. Different freedoms, maybe, but both of us would get exactly what we'd chosen. And I was fine with that.